There is a difference between suspicion and evidence. Most people understand that in theory. Far fewer people are willing to live with it when a story becomes emotional. And right now, the Whitaker story has reached exactly that point. Because a new question is beginning to circulate through comment sections, live streams, Facebook groups, reaction channels, and discussions that refuse to disappear. Did Eric Carroll make a deal? Not a public deal. Not a documented agreement people can point to and verify. A secret deal. A quiet arrangement. A behind-the-scenes understanding that somehow allowed him to walk away from a situation that continues creating consequences for everyone else involved. The allegation is serious. The confidence with which some people repeat it is even more serious. Because once an audience begins believing that outcomes can only be explained by hidden agreements, every public explanation starts sounding incomplete. Every statement becomes suspicious. Every denial becomes evidence. Every silence becomes proof. And that is where this story now finds itself. Not in the realm of confirmed facts. In the realm of competing interpretations. Because if you listen carefully to what people are arguing, they are not actually debating what happened anymore. They are debating what must have happened. And those are very different conversations. The theory goes something like this. If Patrick became the primary focus of scrutiny, if investigations moved in certain directions, if Eric appears increasingly confident in defending himself publicly, then perhaps something occurred behind closed doors. Perhaps information was exchanged. Perhaps understandings were reached. Perhaps responsibility shifted. Perhaps someone cooperated. Perhaps someone negotiated. Perhaps someone was cleared. The problem is that every version of that theory runs into the same obstacle. Evidence. Not speculation. Not possibility. Evidence. Because regardless of how strongly people feel about Eric Carroll, there's a distinction that matters. An unanswered question is not proof. A suspicion is not proof. A theory is not proof. And right now, much of the current discussion is built from questions rather than answers. That does not mean those questions should be ignored. Far from it. Some of them are legitimate. Some of them deserve scrutiny. Some of them deserve direct responses. But asking questions and proving conclusions remain separate activities. That distinction is becoming increasingly important, especially as emotions continue rising around the case. Part of the reason these theories exist at all is because of timing. Timing creates narratives. It always has. People look at events. They arrange them into sequences. Then they begin assigning meaning. One event happens, then another, then another. Eventually a pattern appears, or at least what looks like a pattern. And once a pattern appears, people start filling in missing details. That process is natural. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We want stories to make sense. We want causes connected to effects. We want explanations. The Whitaker story contains countless gaps, and gaps attract theories. Consider where the story stands today. The family remains separated. The original promises surrounding housing remain controversial. Fundraising questions remain unresolved in the minds of many viewers. Investigations have generated enormous speculation. Public trust has deteriorated. Relationships between major figures have collapsed. Yet despite all of that, there are still pieces of the story ordinary viewers cannot see. And whenever information becomes limited, speculation expands. That is exactly what is happening now. Eric's recent public appearances have added fuel to that process. Not necessarily because of what he said, but because of what people believe his confidence represents. Some viewers interpret it as innocence. Others interpret it as strategy. Some see transparency. Others see narrative management. The same words produce entirely different reactions depending on who is listening. That alone tells us how divided the audience has become. Take the APS issue. Few topics generate stronger reactions. Eric has spoken extensively about adult protective services. He has described meetings, paperwork, guardianship discussions, protective orders, investigations, interactions that he believes have been misunderstood. For supporters, these explanations provide context. For critics, they raise additional concerns. Why was he so involved? Why was APS communicating with him? Why was guardianship discussed? Why did the situation escalate the way it did? Why did everything eventually lead to separation? These questions continue because people are trying to reconcile two competing realities. The first reality is Eric's version. A man who says he became involved because he believed vulnerable people needed help. A man who says he responded to serious concerns. A man who says he spent time, energy, and resources trying to improve a difficult situation. The second reality is the outcome. A family divided. An investigation. Destroyed relationships. Continuing controversy. When people struggle to connect those realities, alternative explanations emerge. That is where theories about secret deals begin. Not necessarily because evidence exists, because people are looking for a missing link. A way to explain how the story moved from point A to point B. There is another reason these allegations have gained traction. Memory. The internet has a surprisingly long memory. People remember videos, statements, live streams, promises, claims, contradictions. Many viewers feel they watched events unfold in real time. They remember what was said months earlier. They remember positions people took. They remember criticisms directed at Betty, criticisms directed at Patrick, criticisms directed at others. Now they hear different language, different emphasis, different interpretations. And naturally they ask questions. Why the change? What happened? What information became available? What caused the shift? Again, these are fair questions. But fair questions do not automatically produce the answers people want. One of the strongest accusations currently circulating is that Eric is attempting to rewrite history. That is a serious charge, because rewriting history implies intentional distortion. It implies that public memory is being challenged not because it is incomplete, but because it is inconvenient. Yet even this accusation runs into complexity, because human memory itself is imperfect. People rarely remember events exactly as they occurred. They remember impressions, emotions, highlights, conclusions. That does not mean those memories are worthless. Only that memory is not the same thing as documentation. This is why the conversation keeps returning to records, documents, financial information, official findings, court records, investigative conclusions. People want something solid, something objective, something that does not depend entirely on interpretation. And until those things appear, debate continues. Another element driving suspicion is the issue of money. Money almost always amplifies controversy, particularly when vulnerable people are involved. People want clear answers. How much came in? How much went out? Who controlled it? Who authorized spending? What was donated? What was delivered? What remained? These questions have lingered for a long time. Long enough that many viewers now see every new development through that lens. When trust declines, financial questions become central. Not because money explains everything, because money is measurable. People can disagree about motives. They can disagree about intentions. But financial records feel objective. That is why demands for transparency remain so persistent. And that is why theories about hidden agreements continue spreading. Because in the absence of complete information, people create explanations that fit the outcomes they observe. Whether those explanations are correct is another matter entirely. What is clear is that the Whitaker story has entered a new phase. Not a phase dominated by videos. Not a phase dominated by fundraising. Not a phase dominated by housing plans. A phase dominated by interpretation. Everyone is looking backward now, trying to understand what happened, trying to identify turning points, trying to determine who deserves credit, blame, accountability, or sympathy. And in that environment, every unanswered question grows larger, especially questions involving Eric Carroll, because whether someone supports him or criticizes him, one reality remains impossible to ignore. His role became significant enough that people still believe understanding his actions may help explain how this entire story unfolded. The question is whether the answers people are looking for actually exist, or whether the audience is trying to force a complicated story into a simple explanation. Because sometimes the most uncomfortable possibility is not that a secret deal exists. It is that the truth is messier than any theory people have invented so far. And that possibility may be harder to accept than any conspiracy. Comment below. Do you think the public is still missing a major piece of the Whitaker story? Or do you think most of the important facts are already known? The reason this story refuses to disappear is because every answer seems to create a second question. That is where the conversation surrounding Eric Carroll currently sits. Not at a point of resolution, at a point of escalation. Because for every explanation Eric provides, there's a group of people asking why that explanation raises new concerns instead of settling old ones. And perhaps the clearest example is the issue of responsibility. When Eric speaks publicly now, one theme appears repeatedly. He argues that people have misunderstood his role. He argues that his actions have been mischaracterized. He argues that he became a convenient target because he was visible. Those are serious arguments, and they deserve to be evaluated fairly. But critics immediately respond with a different question. If your role was smaller than people believe, why does your name keep appearing at major turning points in the story? That question sits at the center of everything. Because when people look back at the timeline, they keep seeing Eric present during critical moments. The housing discussions, the fundraising discussions, the APS involvement, the protective orders, the court appearances, the guardianship conversations, the family crisis, the aftermath. Again, being present does not automatically create responsibility, but it does create scrutiny. And scrutiny increases when outcomes remain controversial. Imagine for a moment that the Whitaker story had ended differently. Imagine a completed home. Imagine stable living conditions. Imagine improved services. Imagine the family remaining together. Imagine no investigations. Imagine no public disputes. Imagine no accusations. In that version of events, many of the same actions might be viewed entirely differently. People often judge processes through outcomes. That may not always be fair, but it is undeniably human. And because the outcome became controversial, every earlier decision is now being re-examined. That includes decisions involving money. Money remains the most persistent issue in this entire story. Not because it is the most emotional issue, because it is the most measurable. People can argue endlessly about intentions. They can argue endlessly about motives. They can argue endlessly about personality. But money creates records, and records create expectations. One criticism repeatedly raised by observers is remarkably straightforward. If substantial resources existed, why was the solution so complicated? That question continues resurfacing because simplicity often appears obvious in hindsight. Some people argue that a basic housing solution could have been implemented much faster. Others argue that legal, logistical, and property complications made everything more difficult than viewers understood. Both positions have supporters. Both positions contain elements that deserve consideration. But the fact that people are still debating housing years later tells us something important. The project never produced the clarity people expected. And when clarity is absent, suspicion grows. This brings us to another issue. Narrative control. Every public controversy eventually becomes a battle over narrative. Not necessarily because people are lying, Because everyone interprets events differently. Eric is attempting to establish a narrative. His critics are attempting to establish a narrative. Supporters of Patrick establish another narrative. Supporters of Betty establish another. Observers create dozens more. Eventually, the public finds itself choosing between competing versions of reality. That is where the Whitaker story exists today. A conflict not just over facts. A conflict over interpretation. Take the question of APS. Few topics create stronger reactions. Supporters of Eric often describe APS involvement as a response to serious concerns. Critics often describe APS involvement as a catalyst that accelerated family separation. Notice something important. Those two statements are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Both could contain truth. APS could have been responding to genuine concerns while also triggering consequences that remain painful. Reality often works that way. Complicated situations rarely produce clean outcomes. Yet public debate constantly pressures people towards simple conclusions. Choose a side. Choose a hero. Choose a villain. Choose a narrative. But what if the story refuses to fit those categories? What if multiple people made mistakes? What if multiple people genuinely believed they were helping? What if some actions were beneficial while others were harmful? What if accountability is distributed rather than concentrated? Those possibilities are much harder to discuss. They require nuance, and nuance rarely goes viral. Another issue driving current speculation involves timing. Specifically, the timing of Eric's public return. For months, people wondered whether he would speak again. Then suddenly he reappears. He addresses allegations. He explains his perspective. He discusses documents. He discusses APS. He discusses guardianship. He discusses investigations. Naturally, people ask why now. That question alone has generated enormous speculation. Some believe he is simply defending himself. Others believe he is preparing for future developments. Others believe he is responding to increasing public pressure. And some believe his return indicates information the public has not yet seen. Again, none of those possibilities are confirmed. But they illustrate how uncertainty creates theories. The less information available, the more interpretation fills the gap. That process becomes even stronger when investigations remain unresolved. Because investigations create a vacuum. People dislike uncertainty. They want conclusions. They want final answers. They want official statements. When those things do not arrive, speculation takes over. That is exactly what has happened here. Notice how often discussions now focus on what people think must be happening, not what they know is happening. That distinction matters enormously, because certainty can become detached from evidence. And once that happens, public opinion becomes increasingly difficult to evaluate. One person becomes absolutely convinced of one theory. Another becomes equally convinced of the opposite. Neither possesses definitive proof, yet both feel certain. The Whitaker story has produced countless examples of this dynamic, which is why separating fact from interpretation remains essential. Consider the allegation that Eric somehow arranged favorable treatment for himself. It is a powerful claim, but powerful claims require powerful evidence. Without evidence, the allegation remains a theory. A theory may eventually prove correct. It may eventually prove false. But until evidence emerges, it remains a theory. That distinction protects everyone, not just Eric, everyone involved. Because once standards of evidence disappear, public discussion becomes impossible. Every rumor becomes fact. Every assumption becomes certainty. Every suspicion becomes guilt. That benefits nobody, especially in a story already filled with confusion. There's another reason people remain focused on Eric. Visibility. Visibility creates accountability. Whether fair or unfair, the people audiences see become symbols. Eric became visible. Patrick became visible. Mark became visible. Betty became visible. The family became visible. Visibility changes expectations. People expect answers from visible figures. People expect explanations. People expect transparency. People expect consistency. When those expectations are not met, trust erodes. And once trust erodes, every future explanation faces a higher burden. That may be the real challenge Eric faces now. Not proving one specific point. Rebuilding credibility with people who believe credibility was already lost. That is a much harder task, because credibility cannot be restored through a single statement. It requires time, documentation, consistency, and often independent verification. Until then, debate continues. Which brings us back to the central allegation. Did Eric make a secret deal? Right now, there is a critical distinction people should remember. There is a difference between asking whether something happened and claiming it happened. The first is inquiry. The second is conclusion. Many people have moved from inquiry to conclusion without crossing the bridge in between. That bridge is evidence. And evidence remains the missing piece. Not because questions are inappropriate. Questions are necessary, particularly when vulnerable people, public fundraising, and investigations intersect. The questions should continue. Transparency should continue. Accountability should continue. But questions and conclusions should not become interchangeable, because once they do, the search for truth becomes secondary to the defense of existing beliefs. And that may be the greatest risk facing this entire story. Not that people disagree, that people stop caring whether their conclusions can actually be proven. For now, the reality remains surprisingly simple. Questions remain. Investigations remain. Public skepticism remains. Eric continues defending his role. Critics continue challenging his explanations. And the gap between those positions remains as wide as ever. Which means the most important chapter of this story may not be behind us. It may still be ahead. Comment below. If official investigations eventually end without major new revelations, do you think public suspicion will disappear, or has the Whitaker story already moved beyond what official findings can resolve? The longer this story continues, the less it seems to be about one person. That may be the most important realization of all. Because when people first began asking questions about Eric Carroll, many believed the answers would eventually be straightforward. Records would appear. Investigations would conclude. Statements would be verified. Responsibility would become clear. The story would settle. Instead, the opposite happened. The more information emerged, the more complicated the picture became. And that complexity is exactly why allegations about secret deals continue gaining attention. Not because evidence has suddenly appeared. Because uncertainty remains. People are trying to make sense of outcomes that still feel unfinished. Look at where everything stands. The Whitaker family remains divided. Questions about money continue circulating. Questions about content creation continue circulating. Questions about APS continue circulating. Questions about accountability continue circulating. And perhaps most importantly, questions about who actually benefited from the entire situation continue circulating. That last question may be the one driving everything. Because when viewers look back at years of content, donations, fundraising, interviews, live streams, trips, meetings, promises, and public attention, they naturally ask what changed. Not what was discussed. What changed? Did the family become more secure? Did they become more stable? Did they become more protected? Did they gain greater independence? Or did attention create consequences nobody anticipated? Those questions are difficult because they force people to focus on outcomes rather than intentions. Intentions are often unknowable. Outcomes are visible. And visible outcomes are exactly what keep this debate alive. Eric's critics argue that regardless of intentions, the result speaks for itself. Supporters argue that outcomes cannot automatically be blamed on one person, especially when multiple agencies, family members, creators, and circumstances were involved. Both arguments contain logic. Both arguments contain weaknesses. And that is why neither side has fully convinced the other. The reality may be that the Whitaker story became larger than any individual involved. Larger than Patrick. Larger than Eric. Larger than Betty. Larger than the family itself. Once millions of people became emotionally invested, the story developed a life of its own. Every development created new interpretations. Every silence created new theories. Every statement created new disputes. Eventually, the conversation stopped being driven by facts alone. It became driven by trust. And trust is much harder to restore than facts. A document can answer a question. A financial record can answer a question. A court filing can answer a question. But trust operates differently. Trust depends on consistency. Trust depends on credibility. Trust depends on whether people believe the person speaking. And right now, that may be the real issue facing Eric Carroll. Not legal questions. Not investigative questions. Trust questions. Because many people no longer evaluate his statements by asking, "Is this possible?" They evaluate them by asking, "Do I believe him?" That shift changes everything. Once discussions reach that stage, evidence matters more than ever. Not because evidence ends debate. Because evidence creates common ground. Without it, every side simply retreats deeper into its existing position. That is exactly what appears to be happening. Some viewers see Eric's recent appearances as transparency. Others see them as damage control. Some see accountability. Others see narrative management. The same videos produce completely different conclusions depending on who is watching. That tells us something important. The argument is no longer about information. The argument is about interpretation. An interpretation rarely ends with one live stream, one interview, or one explanation. There is another uncomfortable possibility people rarely discuss. What if there is no secret deal? What if the explanation is far less dramatic than the internet expects? History shows that complicated situations often produce disappointing conclusions. Not grand conspiracies. Not secret agreements. Not hidden masterminds. Just confusion. Poor decisions. Conflicting motives. Miscommunication. Institutional delays. Human error. Those explanations are rarely satisfying. People prefer dramatic answers. Dramatic answers feel complete. Messy answers feel unfinished. The Whitaker story may ultimately belong to the second category. A story where multiple people made decisions they believed were reasonable. A story where some people benefited while others suffered. A story where attention created opportunities and problems simultaneously. A story where good intentions and bad outcomes may have existed side by side. If that is true, it would explain why no single explanation has successfully resolved the controversy. Because there was never one cause. There were many. That possibility does not eliminate accountability. Far from it. People should still ask questions. People should still seek transparency. People should still examine financial claims. People should still evaluate public statements. Accountability remains essential. But accountability works best when it follows evidence rather than assumptions. That distinction becomes increasingly important as speculation grows. Because once public conversations become driven entirely by theory, every future development gets filtered through suspicion. And suspicion can become impossible to satisfy. No explanation becomes enough. No document becomes enough. No statement becomes enough. Everything gets interpreted through existing beliefs. That is why the next phase of this story matters. Not because another allegation surfaced. Not because another creator responded. Not because another theory appeared. Because eventually, questions reach a point where only evidence can move the conversation forward. The Whitaker story seems to be approaching that point. People have debated motives. They have debated intentions. They have debated personalities. Now many want something more concrete. Something that can be independently verified. Something that exists beyond opinions. Until that arrives, the story will likely remain suspended between two competing possibilities. One possibility is that Eric Carroll is exactly what he says he is, a person who became involved in a difficult situation, tried to help, made mistakes, and is now attempting to defend himself against accusations he believes are unfair. The other possibility is that critics are correct, that major parts of the public story remain undisclosed, and that future information may change how people understand his role. At this moment, neither position has completely won. Neither position has completely disappeared. Both continue existing because the evidence people want has not fully arrived. And that may be the most honest conclusion available right now. Not certainty, not vindication, not condemnation, uncertainty. A story still being argued, a story still being interpreted, a story still producing questions faster than answers. And until those answers become clearer, one reality remains impossible to ignore. The Whitaker story was never just about what happened to one family. It became a story about trust, accountability, internet influence, vulnerable people, public money, and the complicated consequences that emerge when all those forces collide. Whether Eric Carroll ultimately clears his name or not may only answer one part of that story. The larger questions may remain long after the arguments about him finally end. Comment below, do you think the biggest unanswered question is about money, accountability, APS involvement, or something else entirely? And why?